Hi listeners, Jason here. Joelle, Peter, Haley and I are taking a 5-week podcasting break over the Christmas period to fill our buckets in preparation for what is going to be a huge 2024. For those that hate to go a week, however, without a Psych, Health and Safety podcast, we've got you covered with 5 of our very favourite episodes from 2023. Definitely take a listen if you missed any of these episodes during the year. On behalf of the team, we wish you a happy and safe holiday period and look forward to bringing you more of the very best in Psych, Health and Safety when we return on 16 January. Now, on to this episode.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health and Safety podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych, Health and Safety podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How today, Joelle?
I'm okay. My son is turning 10 next month, so that's a bit alarming.
Yeah. I think he had, he was probably 7 when we started the show. So
Yeah.
So, time flies.
It does.
Yeah, double digits.
Yes. Yeah. So we've just been planning his party. He was having some trouble deciding what he wanted to do and was getting a bit worried about it. So fortunately we've landed on something and it should be fine.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So you did a parkour party last time. So what is it this time?
Video gaming.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So 2 of his loves.
Yeah, and this one, it's at a place that has lots of gaming consoles kind of dating right back to the original Ataris and those sorts of things through like all of the different iterations of the Nintendos and PlayStations and all of that. And they've got, all sort of backlog of old games and things as well. So, it should be good.
Yeah, no, she'll love it. Yeah. So I was a bit disappointed that you didn't accept my invitation for a training experience that we've got on this Friday at work.
Is that what we're calling that?
Well, sure. What else should we call it?
Listeners, we'd love your feedback on this. So I got a meeting request from Jason that said sexual harassment VR on the couch, and that was it. No context.
The location was on the couch.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Location couch, yeah. So sexual harassment VR.
Location
on the couch.
Yeah.
No context in the email invitation for 2 hours. Yeah.
I don't know how long sexual harassment usually lasts. What can I say?
I don't know why I would need to participate in a VR experience when I've had regular experience of sexual harassment.
Not since you've been working
here. Not here. In throughout my career.
Yeah.
Working as a woman in the resources industries.
Yeah.
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 I don't need the virtual experience. I've had the real thing.
Well, look, I'm curious about what this thing is. I've had many people talk about, we can use VR for sexual harassment training or for vicarious trauma training or, for, what was the other one? Psychological safety. I'm like, really? So I'm not sure how VR is going to help with sexual harassment training. I could sort of see the vicarious trauma maybe. Yeah.
But the sexual harassment stuff is so intrinsically linked with like power dynamics and physicality and that kind of thing. I really have, Hey,
I got hit up by LinkedIn with a local technology vendor. I don't think they know what sort of skeptics they're walking into. I think it's going to be interesting. But it was
never trying to sell to organizational psychologists, people. It's unless you're rock solid.
Yeah, and look, it was deliberately ambiguous calendar invitation for the lols.
Yeah,
well, didn't disappoint this one.
There was certainly lols. Yeah.
All right, just some of the shenanigans we get up to, but
I've been invited to sexual harassment on the couch.
Yeah, in VR though, it's not real sexual harassment. Just
what if it ends up being vicarious sexual harassment, Jason?
Hey, look.
What if we're providing all of our co-workers with the means to actually sexually harass each other because we're condoning it because we've set it in the calendar as a training appointment?
Yeah, look, maybe they haven't considered the hazard that they're bringing in. When they bring in a control like training, what sort of other potential consequence there might be. So
very true.
Yeah, we'll find out tomorrow.
It was training.
And
you didn't take that seriously, did you?
It wasn't real.
Yeah. I didn't actually mean what I said about your private parts. It was for the purposes of training.
It was virtual. We'll report back, listeners, on our experience.
But let's introduce our guest.
Yeah,
he's having a hard time not laughing out loud over there. So
we'll have to ask him about his experience with VR sexual harassment. So he has extensive experience in the public sector, including working with the New Zealand Health and Safety Regulator through the Pike River mine tragedy, major health and safety ecosystem reforms, and was directly involved in establishing WorkSafe New Zealand. He is now the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. A warm welcome to the podcast, Francois Barton.
Afternoon. And by the way, courageous conversation, Jason, around this sexual harassment VR. I was sitting there thinking you're a braver man than I, trying to have this thought experiment live with your listeners. So courage is to be admired, though. Courage is to be admired.
We're going in skeptical, but we will evaluate and report back. So
I think Jason has largely done this for the purposes of his own entertainment more than anything.
I suspect I picked that up.
And it was more Joelle's reaction more than anything else.
Yeah.
And like I said, she didn't disappoint. So that was great. But glad to have you on.
Nice. Yeah, no, thank you. Really looking forward to the conversation.
So, Francois, as you know, we like to ask a couple of easy questions to get into it. So what podcasts are you listening to?
I'm a tragic. I tend to listen. I don't listen to work podcasts at all. I'm lucky enough to enjoy lots of stimulating conversations as part of my day job. So podcasts for me are like a step out. So I'm stuck between politics and history, where I tend to go. I'm a huge fan of Rest is Politics, which is Alistair Campbell, which is Tony Blair's former spin doctor, and Rory Stewart, who's a former Conservative MP, and they have a really interesting take on global politics, particularly UK politics, but global politics. The Rest is History is a really interesting sort of history podcast from origins of America to World War III, 2, 1, you name it, a really interesting history perspective. And in the spirit of long form, Hardcore History, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He has a 6-episode, 4-hour per episode history of World War I.
Wow.
And I've listened to it 5 times. And he just takes full toll of storytelling and just completely and utterly just envelops the listener in these stories and narratives around these big historical themes. So, yeah, I really just enjoy getting, I studied history at university, so I don't bring any technical capability to my professional job at all, other than, I think history very rarely repeats, but it often rhymes. And I think the ability to look back at where we've got things, where things have happened in the past and what can they sort of give us a sense of going forward, really fascinates me. So the history political sort of interface I find, hugely relevant. And probably the geeky part in me from a work perspective, I just see our work sits in society. Business work is part of businesses sit in our environment, in our community, which are impacted by our political space, which are, a reflection of history. So, yeah, I really love looking at history and politics.
I listen to a history podcast as well, but it's not as highbrow as that. The one I listen to is called, The Dollop. So it's these two American comedians who do it's mostly American history. So one of them will basically choose an event and tell the story to the other one who doesn't know anything about it. But they go on tour. So when they're on tour, they do like local history. So they've toured quite a bit in Australia as well, which is quite interesting. And hearing them do like the first Thanksgiving from America, and then do contrast that with like sort of Australian colonisation or
Ned Kelly, didn't they do?
They did, but they've done actually like sort of the first fleet to arrive in Australia and kind of how all of that happened. And then it kind of gives you some framing for why Australia and America are so very different.
Well, I really like, I think, I think it's the great thing about the rise of podcasts is that they provide an opportunity for to bring these topics which historically have either been, sort of leather-bound library shelves into actually a common way of engaging on these things that, they're made by humans, that humans will continue to engage with. Actually, maybe one that's a little bit like that, which is both fun, is probably the other one I listen to a lot of, is called Origin Story. And it's two British journalists, and they look at the origins of key words or key concepts. So the word neoliberal. So they'll do an hour on what do we mean? What is it? And their basic view is, and it's probably quite a nice sort of segue into what we're talking about today, is what do we mean by these words? How are they used in common parlance, and what's the implication of that use? And so, neoliberalism. They did one on Ayn Rand, for instance. So, both concepts and people, and fascinating. So, I mean, I just think anything that makes the critical thought come to life, it's got my vote any day of the week.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, can you tell us, please, about your professional career?
Well, sold Christmas trees in London. Pruned and picked grapes in New Zealand and in Europe. Taught English in Zurich. So a real grab bag of work until I was about 30, and the real world finally caught up with me. My more serious, probably, professional career saw me work in government, both environment, the Ministry of the Environment around sustainable industry, and then I got involved in the regulator for about 9 or 10 years in the area of health and safety. But the red thread through all of those has been working from government, but with business and alongside business around how do we enable businesses in whatever sector they're in to be productively sustainable or productively safe or productively well. So, as we used to say when I was in environmental sustainability, you can't be green if you're in the red. So this is not a question of not being profitable, but it's how do we do that, not just for the next 6 months, but how do we do that over a longer period of time? And in the environment space, you're often doing that through sort of industry standards and brand market brands and things like that. And I just got tired of the absence of any more formal controls or regulations in some regards. So the opportunity to go into the then Department of Labour in New Zealand, which subsequently got rolled into an independent regulator in WorkSafe following a major mine tragedy we had back in 2010, was to sort of get an experiment of what's it like working in a context where you've got sort of regulatory compulsion as part of your toolkit to affect change. Because it looked easier in the environmental space. It'd be great if there was a rule around this, I thought. And very, very quickly realised that actually the presence of a regulation or a rule does not have necessarily any impact on whether people will choose to do it or not. It certainly has an impact on how they view what you're asking them to do. And so, through that experience, the role, I got very, very interested very quickly around the role of organisational culture driving performance. And if you're interested in culture, the only common ingredient is always leadership. And when I looked at the role of leadership driving culture and culture driving performance in New Zealand at the time, we just didn't have senior leadership as an agenda item around the health and safety discussion. Well, mental health was not even anywhere near the agenda at that point, back in 2009, 10. So we built the forum. We sort of thought we engaged with, from the Department of Labour, engaged with a bunch of business leaders and had the support of our chief executive at the time. And we created a forum of business leaders who wanted to come together to sort of, I guess, really indicate the importance of their leadership work at the top around, the cultures they create within their organisations. And so I helped get that established and then stood back into my WorkSafe role, but then had the opportunity about 8 years to step back into the chief executive role of the forum. And that's where I've been since, which kind of brings the best of all of my work experience together. If I think of my language teaching as a joke, but more seriously, language is complex. So how do you distill complexity for people to be able to actually, get to the nub of the issues? Environment was how do I work with businesses around good sustainable business practices? And health, safety, and mental well-being, again, are really sort of social sustainability drivers. So, I mean, my basic philosophy is I don't think business is a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a really important thing. And most business leaders I meet want to do the right thing. It's a question of how do we understand the issues so we can understand our work around those issues. And so translation, distilling, and then helping activate's been a really strong thread through all of those careers, from language teaching to environmental sustainability to health and safety, and latterly with business leadership around mental health at work.
So, that's an interesting thing. And I guess in New Zealand you would have a lot of grapes to pick back in your 20s. Yeah. Nice wine growing region. Some good.
I can assure you, my home. I'm actually talking to you from Marlborough, which is the top of the South Island in New Zealand. For those who know, produces 80% of New Zealand's wine, and is the Sauvignon capital of the world. I don't like Sauvignon Blanc for what it's worth, and I can assure you there is no romance in working in a vineyard. You don't do something once; it happens 25,000 times. But yeah, no, I mean, again, it was a real privilege, I think, growing up in a province like Marlborough, in terms of being connected to real work, and understanding the breadth of people that do work, and again, I think being closer to businesses in their communities about their intentions, I guess, and I think sometimes, particularly in a government situation, there can often be skepticism around where business is coming from. I like to start from a sort of a benefit of the doubt perspective, I guess, around, best intentions, so how do I help people translate their intention? So if you're telling me you care, okay, how do we make sense of what that means? How does that turn up in your leadership of your business so that you're profitable and that care gets expressed? And so, it's going to be a big theme, I guess, we're going to duck in and out of through today's conversation, but it's that translation of a concept to action is the hard part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in your role as chief executive, that's something that you're trying to distill, right, and to spread. So what does your role as chief executive of the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum entail?
Well, listening a lot, engaging and listening a lot. So, we've got about 400 chief executive members across the New Zealand business landscape, from public sector and private sector, local government, profit, not-for-profit. So, I can't go in there with lots of answers. I need to be really listening and asking lots of questions. And so a huge part of my role is both one-on-one and in larger groups, really connecting with those chief executives and what I call their chief executive constellation, that board, their engagement up into a board environment from an authorising perspective, because, what interests the boss fascinates the team. Well, the board is the chief executive's boss in many cases, so that governance angle is really important. But also, chief executives in many regards don't do a lot. They really help activate and direct what others do, and so their executive team and that senior management groups. So I call that that constellation piece. I spend a lot of time engaging with those people, understanding what their issues are, understanding where their challenges are, understanding where their ambitions are. And so from a forum perspective, I can't get too technical at all, because talking to a transport sector is very different to talking to public sector. It's very different to talking to meat processing or viticulture or winemaking. So how do we go to what I often call the Shakespearean themes around these issues? What are the common things that are always of importance that are challenging for everybody? And so I spend a lot of time listening. The distillation often doesn't always occur in my head. In fact, it very rarely occurs in my head. It occurs with them pulling together other groups of leaders and experts, and pulling together those that know and have the detail. And then we develop resources, reflective resources, so question-heavy resources that enable businesses to solve their own problems, I guess, because no one knows their context better than they do. So I'm not going to tell them otherwise. We get to host a lot of discussions, both with experts and with New Zealand leaders as well, to share what's good. And increasingly, we're realizing, no matter how good you are within your own organization, you operate in a national ecosystem. And so the role of regulators, the role of the whole government system, the government ecosystem, can be helping and hindering doing the right thing. So we're increasingly starting to think about what's a good system advocacy role that we can play, because we have quite a unique perspective across a range of sectors at a senior level around the things that are making being safe and healthy and mentally well and productive harder than it needs to be sometimes. And so obviously COVID and the impact around supply chains and migration levels and borders being open and global labor shortages and plus also just everybody being absolutely exhausted. what's our sort of story to the system around what we need to enable businesses to be the best they can for themselves and for their people. So yeah, it's a great job. I mean, I get permission to be really curious and wide ranging. And I get to basically, by definition, talk to really, really high performing, smart people. So yeah, there's not been a day in the last 8 years where I've not felt hugely privileged, at the opportunity I get. So yeah, it's great. It's quite a unique role. I mean, the forum itself is actually, to our best of our knowledge, is globally unique. We're not aware of anywhere else in the world where there is a dedicated chief executive forum in service of healthy, safe and productive work. So it's a real privilege.
Yeah, well, definitely your work and the work of those within the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum has travelled across the ditch. So we're definitely aware of it in Australia, and we've seen some of the great resources that have gone out. Yeah, conquering nice. Australia is no mean feat for a New Zealander with the barriers. It's great what you're doing, and interested to unpack a bit more about the work, particularly around psych health and safety.
Yeah, so leading on from that, can you tell us about some of the work the forum is doing in psychological health and safety?
I mean, I remember we've been sort of in a dedicated way, really zeroing in on this for probably since about 2018. So crikey, what's that? 5 years. And like I said, coming out of the regulator, the idea of work-related health issues, so exposures to things like fumes and gases and dusts and stuff like that, I'd always been acutely aware that we tend to shout safety and whisper health. Well, we weren't even murmuring mental health at that time. And what I was seeing in 2017, 2018 was just this real myriad of conversations around things that felt, was it wellness? Was it well-being? Was it the moment the M word came out and mental or psychological came in, everybody freaked out. And I was really reluctant, given the absence of traction I was seeing around work-related health issues, asbestos, isocyanates, and these sort of really hard-edged work-related health risks, to go and confuse the conversation further with another topic on an already full agenda that wasn't progressing as fast as it was. So I wasn't saying it wasn't important. I was just very mindful of how do we step into this conversation. So when I put forward my work plan for the year to my board and mental health wasn't on it, they said, "Where's mental health?" And I basically told them what I just said to you, and they said, "Yeah, we'll get it in there. So you need to work it." And so it was a good example of the board putting good tension on their chief executive. So what we did was we realized very early on, almost like as a function of what I was saying just now, was there was just no clarity of what we meant. When people said, and we tend to use, rather than psychological health and safety, the language we tend to use here is more mental health and well-being. I could say what it is, and the diversity or the spectrum of understanding of what people thought I meant, or what they thought when I said those words, was from, well-meaning executives talking about healthy body, healthy mind. And so going to a whole bunch of things around, important elements around physical fitness, smoking cessation, healthy eating. And again, thumbs up, good, important work, real connection, no issue at all. I could talk to another CEO who was grappling with having lost 2 or 3 of their staff members in the previous year to suicide. And so suicide prevention was the conversation. But the problem is none of it was explicit. None of it was in the open. And so the conversations we were having around mental well-being is, one might think we're talking suicide prevention. Another might think we're talking healthy eating. And then you're talking to your health and safety or your GM or your HR people bringing their solutions to the table, there was a lot of confusion over, well, why are you giving me a suicide prevention program? I thought we were going to get a cooking expert in. Well, why have you got a cooking expert in? I thought we were dealing with suicide prevention. So what became really, really clear for us early on was we needed to really provide some support. Step one was, and kind of still remains, do we understand the issues? Because if we don't understand our issues, we can't understand our work. And so that's really where we've spent and anchored a huge amount of our effort over the last 5 years, as we've built from that foundation. When we say mental health at work, what do we mean? And from there, we can then tackle and step into, what are the implications for me as a chief executive, and what are the implications for us as an organization, and what are the implications for our people and our communities? But if we don't clear our terms, if we don't clarify our terms and we're not on the same page, the ability for us to make sense of our work becomes, really, really, really challenging.
Yeah, and so that sort of happens in discussion with the member organisations, and then sort of feeds into work products like guidance material and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I think step one for us was let's test that assumption that we're not clear on what the issues were, and like I say, as useful as my University of Otago history degree is, I certainly don't have expertise in the area of trying to unpick this issue. So in New Zealand, we're very fortunate to have in a long-term forum friend, Dr. Hilary Bennett, who's probably reasonably well known, not just in New Zealand, but who's been working her entire career in this wider area, and she's been helping us with a lot of our executive leadership work. But this is her real passion. So we engaged with Hilary as a strategic partner to really help us unpick what do we mean by mental health and mental well-being. And we actually spent quite a lot of time getting clear on that and anchoring it to, at that time, the ISO standard wasn't yet out, but anchoring it to WHO, anchoring it to British Safety Council, anchoring it to good emergent evidence-based frameworks, and then thinking, how do we then distill and explain that in ways that a business leader can understand? And the idea of, and this won't be remotely new to anyone on this call, but the idea that so that the things we ended up sort of unpicking and being able to sort of say is, when we say mental health, let's be honest, most people feel that it is mental ill health, not the presence of health. So step one was saying, actually, this is a continuum. Actually, just anchoring the fact that, and we use the unwell to thriving continuum. So when we say mental health, we don't just mean depression, anxiety, suicide, and distress. We mean a continuum. And this is, I'm not telling you these things to educate you, but this was the conversation we were having. It's a continuum everybody is on. This isn't a frontline issue. This is a person issue. If you're a human, you're on this continuum. So it's universal. You're moving up and down it all the time. So it's dynamic. The things that move you up and down aren't going to be singular. It's going to be home. It's going to be work. It's going to be brain chemistry. It's going to be climatic. It's going to be footy results. It's going to be lots of things. And how you respond to something is going to be different than how I respond to these things. And so a continuum that is dynamic, universal, subjective, and holistic is really, really, really important to understand. And so stopping and really making sure that's what we're talking about. And I think, and that's not like other risks we tend to deal with in a safety and a health space, because we tend to deal with often things that are more, gravity is not subjective, gravity is objective. 1,000 volts of electricity is objectively fatal. Actually, the only person that's exposed to the fall is the person that was working at height in the first place, not everyone at work. And if you engineer things well, there's always a level of dynamic risk going on in a workplace, but there are some of these risks, a lot of these risks we can actually engineer out. So this idea of, and actually, I'm only going to get vaulted at a work-related electricity issue at work, not at home, or not in my marriage, or not at the footy club, or not at home with my kids. So these universal, dynamic, holistic, subjective risks are way, way different than we're used to dealing with. So why is your head hurting, CEO, around this issue? Because this is difficult and it's different. And I think not making that clear and pretending this is somehow easy or simple is just not doing service to their brains or the issue. So that was a really, really important part of really what we call sense making, was let's be clear about what the issues are. And what that then let us do, I think, in a really helpful way, was get clear, because one of the anxieties that often came from senior leaders I was engaging with was both, what am I not responsible for now, Francois? I'm responsible for people's safety. I'm responsible for people's health. Now I'm responsible for their mental health. And we know from our EAP stats, says Executive A or B, that, a lot of it is stuff that happens at home, And I'm sitting down going, yeah, and it's because it's subjective and it's holistic. But the ability to be able to say, actually it's not all on you. People's mental health is not all on you was actually a really powerful thing to be able to say. But it's not a little bit on you. What impact, if they're coming to work otherwise well, is the work you create for them, the environment and the reason they're coming into your place, is that as good as it can be? And if you don't have a framework that lets you talk about, and that's the holistic piece, work isn't the only thing, but it is one of the things. So therefore, that's the hook to say, you're going to deal with the consequences regardless, but the bit where you've got control, the bit that is on you, is the environment you're creating as good as it can be. And so that then allowed us to go from understanding the issues, allows us to understand the work. And the work is both helping individuals that are individuals, but also focusing on the work. And so we've got a bunch of work that then talks, this was back in 2018. And so the work that Hillary did with us is we talk about proactive work before harm occurs. How do we protect people from risks we create? How do we foster those that are already doing well to be stronger? And then reactively in the presence of harm, how do we support, how do we reclaim and restore those that are struggling? And how do we support those that are unwell? And this idea of, and so I know that there's other ways of sort of framing that, but again, if we hug to the evidence, the point is there's a spreadsheet, there's a balance of activities we need to be doing. And so all of a sudden, the idea that yoga mats is going to fix your problems, of course it's not going to fix your problems. And anyone that tells you it is clearly lying to you. But you need to be thinking about it if it's a holistic issue, you need to be thinking around a holistic, or what we call a balanced approach, or playing the full field, or covering all the bases, And what we tend to find actually is that isn't what happens. We tend to find there's a real attraction to the individual, and a challenge about really looking at the work. But if you don't understand the issues, it's really hard to make sense of the work. And so really that's where I think that's the cornerstone of the work we've been doing for 5 years. Everything we do comes back to those things. If you care about the mental health of your people, you need to accept what it is, and then from there get clear what's yours, what's the obligation, and the obligation is the work you create, and where are the opportunities to help foster and restore people's well-being. So you've got some choice and some control there. And broadly speaking, I wouldn't say it's necessarily transformed it for lots of people, but the ability to actually distill it in those terms has allowed a lot of organizations to actually then almost use those 4 quarters almost as their well-being strategy. What are we doing across those 4 domains? That's been a big part of our work. And I can talk about some other bits subsequently, but I just leave it there.
Yeah, I think that that paradigm shift from mental health is something people bring to work with them versus mental health is something that can be influenced by work. That's one of the biggest things that we find we need to sort of help our clients with in order to actually get them then thinking strategically about what they can do, what's within their control. Because, there's, I guess, this sort of history that we have of really framing mental health as something that exists inside somebody. And so helping people to make that switch in thinking, and also to, I guess, move away from, well, how do we know if it's a work issue or a home issue? Well, okay, if somebody does, rock climbing and base jumping in their personal time and then they work as a scaffolder for you, you don't decide whether or not you're going to give them fall protection based on what they do in their leisure time. If they're exposed to a heights hazard while they're at work, you need to protect them from that heights hazard as far as you can. Same for psychosocial hazards. It doesn't matter what's going on in their home life. If you're exposing them to the potential for harm at work, you need to take steps to prevent that as far as you can.
Well, and I mean, a bit of a sore spot for you is we're good at rugby here. Better than Australia.
not for Joelle directly, no.
No, I don't sports ball at all.
No.
But we're also in Western Australia, so we're more AFL than rugby over here.
I won't
anyway.
talk cricket. I won't talk cricket at all because actually, no. Anyway, I won't get into a sports conversation. But we have a lot of rugby. We play a lot of rugby in New Zealand, and I dislocated when I was playing as a younger man, I dislocated the idea of a rugby injury turning up at work on Monday and guess I can't, if I've got a physical job and I've just dislocated my shoulder, there's kind of a sense of you dumb idiot, but get on with it. So again, I'm not loath to use the word stigma. I sometimes think we overplay the stigma piece as a barrier, but I think it's more of an understanding piece. I actually think we're broadly a lot more comfortable talking about those broader mental health and wellbeing issues in the last 5 or 10 years. Like I think there's been a significant lift in that stigma piece, but I still think there's a level of ignorance, and not pejorative ignorance, but just a genuine, maybe lack of reflection at times. And like to your point, Joelle, I think there's almost an unintended, almost non-pejorative, ignorant double standard that a rugby injury or a mountain climbing accident, there's almost a nobility or it's okay. Whereas the idea that it might be something mental we find that a harder line to accept around home impacting work. And I guess the other thing is
almost like
always impacted work.
Yeah, there's sort of almost an expectation that if it's mental, you can compartmentalize that aspect of it and still, like, you can sort of mentally put that to the side and then just carry on at work as usual, where you can't do that with a physical injury. So there's a little bit of getting past that kind of mentality as well.
I think so. And I mean, I want to be really clear. I mean, my sense is what's really been encouraging for me and affirming and really energizing is, across the forum membership, the vast majority of the business leaders I deal with, they know full well the idea that you leave your personal self at the factory gate before you work. I mean, that's a very minority view now. I think the challenge is, but I can see if they've broken their arm, and to what extent is, and you get into all the old classic issues of, well, what stressful workload for you is actually a good tension for me that keeps me busy. And so again, that's why understanding that mental well-being or mental health in response to these things as a subjective piece is a truth. It's an uncomfortable and difficult truth, and I wish it was other, but it's not. And so the ability to then, I guess, calibrate your response with, anchored to some good core frameworks and evidence-based frameworks becomes then a really important way of being able to navigate it. And whatever the mechanism, the good assessment and evaluation processes let you sort of account for and accommodate for those subjectivities, And so, a recurring thing that people that know me will be sick of me hearing, and whether it's safety or well-being, is that, fools with tools are still fools. And what really worries me about the mental health at work or psychological health and safety bit is that there's a plethora of tools out there, and maybe less in the psychological health and safety. What there is a ton of apps that you can get that will evidently solve all of your problems, and the fact is they won't. And so how do we ensure we're not? And when I use the word fools, I mean it in a sense of, again, non-pejorative ignorance. We've got to know what we're after so that we can pick up the right tools in the right way at the right time. And I always think from as a not-for-profit with a broad membership base, how do we grow smart demand? How do we grow smart informed demand? And so, whether it's, we've got a number of members that are clients of yours. I've got a number of members that are personal clients of Hillary's and Umbrella here in New Zealand and others. So there's a whole bunch of people that work with for me, it's good providers are good providers. Let's drive demand for the right suppliers doing the right work in the right way. And I think that's a really important part of the puzzle for me, because I think organizations need some help to work through this, but they've got to have a base understanding of what's the work they need to go after. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting discussion, and definitely echoes our observations both in New Zealand and in Australia. The model that you have with the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum around mental health, that circle diagram is pretty much bang on with the integrated model. Like you say, though, in that reactive space, it's split into two with, what are the accommodations that you're providing versus what is the support that you're providing to ill workers. So Yeah, we're a fan, and definitely the work that we've been doing with the government health and safety lead there in New Zealand. We've been interacting with a number of CEs in government agencies, and they are very familiar with it. So that's kudos to you and your team for the work in educating them on that and going, well, this is a holistic approach to mental health in the workplace that goes beyond just, like you say, wellbeing apps and trying to apply Band-Aids to bullet wounds. Like, let's actually think about what are we doing to protect harm, and then what are we doing to accommodate and support workers as well.
Yeah, sorry, Jason. Just before you go on, I think that Band-Aids for bullet wounds it's quite a nice. I mean, I remember it was almost like the light went on for me. Around and Hillary was the one that helped flick the switch, was this idea of mentally healthy workers, mentally healthy individuals, and mentally healthy work. And it's just such a powerful, and sometimes I say it and I see in people's eyes, they're saying, yep. And I'm going to think about that again. And I think, Joel, when we spoke recently, someone shared with me recently, she was an Australian director on a New Zealand board here. And she referred to the fish or the aquarium. And I found that it was such a beautiful sort of metaphorical distillation of so much of, and it's true for safety, but especially true for mental health at work, is we spend a lot of time understandably worried about the sick fish. And we either look after the sick fish or take them out and nurse them back and then put them back into an environment that helped contribute to the harm in the first place. And actually what the business and what the organization has control of is bugger all of the fish. But the pH level, the water temperature, the water cleanliness, the quality of the pump, how often is the pump filter changed? What's the quality of the gravel at the bottom? Is there an entertaining little treasure chest with a lid that bobbles up and down? What I can affect the aquarium. And if I can affect the aquarium, I've got a hang of a lot better chance of ensuring the fish that are swimming around are in good health. And so that idea of sort of being mindful of, where are in our well-being efforts, are we focusing more on the aquarium or more on the fish, can be often a way, it's a little bit cute, but actually it allows people quite quickly to go, we're spending a lot of time focusing on the fish. And if I've got 2,000 fish, that's a lot of fish wrangling. But we've got 3 or 4 aquariums across our 3 branches or 3 divisions. All of a sudden, actually, from an efficiency perspective, we're going somewhere different. So, yeah, I'm not willing to be glib with that sort of comparison, but I think it's a really, really, I think it often helps people sort of go, okay, that makes sense, because I'm spending a lot of money on my fish and I'm just not sure it's making a difference. And in this current environment, especially with price of living, inflation, I'm sure you've got inflation issues there. We've just dipped into recession. Once you've spent that dollar, it's gone. And if you're spending your dollar on things that are just subscription only, and you're not sure when you can actually change an environment that will sustain growth under your own and sustain value under your own steam, to me, that's a much smarter place to be, banking your investment and time.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode. Yeah, I love how you're articulating it. You're definitely singing from the same hymn book as what we are. But
what I noticed actually at that last session that we ran over there, that analogy, the fish or the aquarium, once people get it, it's such a useful way to shorthand the conversation because we're all sort of using that language, saying, well, hang on, are we talking about the fish or are we talking about the aquarium? And everybody understood it. And then they were able to move straight into, all right, yeah, no, we need to shift back and talk about the aquarium, not the fish. It is a really, once people get what that means, it's such a great way to shorthand that discussion.
And so when you look at it from if you think you've got filters and you've got water temperature, but when you can put that into a corporate or an organizational context where you've got all your HR functions and you've got your operational demands and you've got all of those corporate assurance, they're all your aquarium levers. And that the beauty of being able to frame that you've actually got more influence at your discretion when your mindset's in the right space at that point than not. Because otherwise it basically just becomes a target for throwing good money after bad at a whole range of people. That's quite like a sugar rush. Whereas I think, one of the examples I shared, I shared at that session, Joel, but I've shared numerously times, was one of our members here they called it a kaitiaki network, which is kaitiaki in Māori is this idea of stewardship, the idea of sort of stewardship, guardianship. And they had a kaitiaki network, which is sort of people from within the organization that were sort of given a little bit sort of like almost a corporate chaplaincy type training, a little bit of sort of mental first aid type stuff, but not there to diagnose and help, but just sort of check in with people. They were sort of diagonally across the business. And they found one of their branches that was a sort of little series of smoke signals of some harm, little smoke signals of some people being distressed. They had and they just saw a pattern. And so that particular kaitiaki had enough awareness to go, there's actually a little bit of where there's a few more puffs of smoke, maybe there's something going on. So they had a quiet word, just a quiet informal word to one of their HR people, the senior HR people, who had a look. And what had transpired was a period of about 3 or 4 years previously, they'd gone through an reorganization for a particular business transition they were going through, brought in a team of people that had the right capability. They nailed it. They did a good job. And because they were successful, the needs of the team shifted. But the skills of the people there and the role descriptions around them didn't. And so what they were starting to actually see once they scratched the surface after these smoke signals drew their attention to it was there was a real dissonance between the jobs being asked and the skill sets of those being asked to do it. And so their role descriptions were just fundamentally not fit for purpose. So they turned role descriptions as one of their sort of, they used it in a safety terms. One of their critical controls they needed to look around the organization was how many of our role descriptions are woefully out of date. And I'm sure this will be a complete surprise to any Australian business that I'm sure is highly efficient. They had a number that weren't up to date. And so they had a team that deal with that. That's their day job. That wasn't they didn't need a degree in psychology to go do our role descriptions. And so all of a sudden it didn't become one of these sort of touching TNT with, do I cut the red cord or the blue cord to stop the bomb exploding? Oh, mental health. Oh, I'm not a psychologist, Francois. No, you're an HR expert. And guess what? People's skill set and what you ask of them is either going to help them or hinder their well-being. And guess what? And so I think what I loved about that was organizations are constantly changing things like role descriptions, reporting lines. You just give these smart people a little bit of a mindset shift around. And are you also considering connection? Are you also considering relationships? Are you also considering people's well-being in that space? Still do the same work, just ask a few different questions, and you can shift the mindset by an inch, and you can all of a sudden see for miles. And I think that's the power of that mindset shift. I think is often underestimated, and I think, we might get onto it later, and I think it's worth repeating. I think the challenge is if you've got not a lot of knowledge, is that you end up telling everybody everything you know. How do you get them to realize in the first place there's actually a small shift that makes them very hungry for more rather than start with more? And I think for what I come across as a non-expert working with a lot of experts in this area is the passion in here is huge. And I proudly say to a whole lot of people, I'm not passionate about health and safety, and I'm not passionate about mental health, because passion tends to mean singular tunnel vision. It tends to mean lack of judgment. It tends to mean I lose proportion. I lose perspective. And actually, I think this is one of these issues where we don't need passion. We need genuine, deliberate, purposeful focus. And step one, I think, is let's be really clear what we're talking about, because then that can unlock where we can then flow with demand, the useful type of expert and specific advice we need. And so I'm talking to chief executives. I'm not talking to communities of psychologists. And so I think there's a trick in there that I'm not saying we've cracked, but I certainly feel it's an area where I often see there's a translation, someone speaking German and someone speaking French, and maybe I'm the Belgian or the Swissy in the middle trying to be able to just help. Actually, look, we're actually talking about the same thing here. How do we just get our mindsets better aligned?
Yeah. No, all beautiful, Francois, and definitely things that we like to discuss. There's a couple of things I just want to bring up, but before I do that, there are some very passionate people here, right, in the workplace mental health space. And some of them are bringing a hammer into the work environment. And so every problem they see is a nail. Yeah. And so you have people from, say, I'm just going to generalize here, okay, but say from a lived experience background or from a positive psychology background or a psychological safety background. And, they'll come in looking at every problem and go, how can we solve it with the tools that we've got?
Yep.
And they'll be very passionate, and they'll sometimes be able to influence leaders who don't know better to go, this person's passionate, they know what they're talking about, let's do this. And I've had to block some of those people on LinkedIn because they get very tunnel vision and go, no, we can't. No, the most important thing we need to do is to provide care to employees. I'm like, morally, yeah, I agree. It's like, let's provide and support those people who are ill. But like, that's not the only thing we do. We take that integrated model, like your mental health model so beautifully depicts. It's like, what are we doing to promote, protect, support, and reclaim? It's not just one or the other. And then even under those 4 pillars, there's kind of like different systems or interventions that we can incorporate to address those goals. I love the fish in the aquarium or the fish in the pond analogy. Peter Kelly loves the fish in the pond analogy. The flower and the soil, like which one do you treat to make it bloom? That's another good one, talking about the individual versus the environment. But one way I also like to talk about the psych health and safety approach is versus the individual approach. This is if you think about something like employee assistance programs, which are there largely to support workers with ill health, they are trying to be promoted more as something that employees can use more proactively, but largely used in more of a reactive sense by employees. If we think about that, where maybe the people who use those services get maybe, let's say, a 20% uplift in their well-being by attending 3 to 6 sessions with a qualified psychologist to take them through something evidence-based like cognitive behavioural therapy. Well, that's great. But we know that the industry average for utilisation of EAPs is under 5%, which means that 95% of your population aren't going to get a 20% uplift in their mental health. And if you were to distill that across a population of thousands or tens of thousands, as some government agencies are, you're actually not even seeing a blip in terms of any mental health improvement across the population. Whereas if you're improving the work environment and people, or the aquarium, right, and people getting the benefit just by being in that environment, well, that's truly primary prevention, because 100% of workers can benefit from that. And they don't have to change any of the behaviours or volunteer to use a service. They're getting the benefit just because they've got better designed work. Yeah. And that, even if it's only having a 5% improvement, you're getting 5% across the population, which from a population health perspective is actually much more beneficial. And we're not saying, you have to change your resource and go, we're going to drop employee assistance. No, it's that but think about where you're going to get biggest bang for buck. And it's typically when you're influencing the environment, and that's something we've learned from health and safety. What are the systemic or engineering type interventions that we can bring in versus relying on individual behaviours?
I think it's a really nice point, Jason. And I think if you think about what assets and capabilities the organisations have, regardless of whether this conversation's going or not, they will have a bunch of, in organisations of any scale will have a range of functions in the people, culture and HR space, and they will have a range of skills and capabilities in the health and occupational health and safety space. And, it's a conversation I know you'll both be acutely aware of, and one we see play out is, well, who's taking the lead? Is this an HR issue, or is this a health and safety issue? And again, what I often think about from a chief executive perspective is you're lucky you've got both. Both of those capabilities are there. And again, maybe slightly oversimplified, but I think often the HR space takes us to the individual, and the safety place takes us to a risk and system approach. And actually, if we can understand and take a slightly more connected view, which is again where the role of the chief executive from a demand perspective can see actually what I want to see, team, is some integrated combined, I'm going to use a terrible military analogy, combined arms. I don't want just one lot of I want, how do I get air cover? How do I get artillery? How do I get it all working together so we get that impact? I think that's why the leadership piece is so important here, because otherwise you end up in, it's true. You get more than two people, you've got politics, right? And so in every organization, there's going to be issues around, who's securing the resources, now I think, we've got to overcome that. Integration of responses needs to be the goal here. And so, yeah, I think again, it just underlines there is really important work, especially if you can frame it around the aquarium or the environment or the pond. That one of the CEO's greatest complexities is breadth, that all the issues roll to their table one way or the other, and equally flow down in a constructive way. So the idea of the work environment is they've got more of the levers that can impact the environment within their wheelhouse than any other function in the room. So the role of the SLT, the exec table, the board, and the CEO, they don't have to pull all the levers, but they have to acknowledge all the levers are pullable. They all can have an influence. So, hey, lever owners, my expectation is that we're being as smart and as integrated as we can. Now, I want to be really clear that I'm not, that's a challenge for a lot of organizations, and I'm not sitting here thinking all of the forum members are completely nailing that, but I'm certain, we did some, at the start of this year, we do these things called CEO connection calls, which are just small group, 3, 4, 5 CEO 1 hour Zoom calls, where I just connect and help facilitate, whatever the topic is. And this year, at the start of the year, we sort of talked about navigating the storm clouds. How are you as CEO seeing 2023 unfold? And it was sobering, in the current environment. And then what do you do? And then so actually general social fatigue and divergence was one of those issues, was one of the issues that people are seeing crankier. I don't know if that translates across people with shorter fuses. We're seeing a rise in violence. We actually had a terrible, today's, the 20th of July, there was a shooting in downtown Auckland where 3 people were killed today. That's an extreme example, but talking across some of the forum members, parking attendants getting pissed on by clients, people being king hit from behind, screwdrivers through eyes of postal workers, not for theft, just for anger. Also just broader fatigue issues around labour shortages and other things. So we didn't just stop there. I said, well, how are you going to navigate these things? And so one of them was around making sure we're really nailing down our critical safety risk control. So that was a really important thing. But keeping our fingers on the pulse of where our people's well-being and mental health was one of the others. And one of our CEOs said in that call, her biggest realization in the last 2 years through the work, that she's been involved in with us was recognizing that changing the work is an option. And it was as simple as that. Now, she's so smart and their organization is really capable. Just knowing that was enough for her to then get a whole lot of other things. So they've leaned into the whole flexible hybrid workspace. They've got lab staff and they've got field staff and meatworks and they've got other staff out on farms. So really, a couple of 1,000, 3,000 people. Now, flexibility is exclusively a question of home or office. Well, that's a really binary conversation. Whereas she completely embraced it. What does flexibility for all mean? How do we can start to define flexibility? And what that did is it addressed employment and recruitment and retention issues, staff equity and fairness. It started to actually increase and allow them to be more flexible from a market response perspective. But it was actually acknowledging that the work is a genuine mode of change rather than it is what it is. And how do we plug something in or roll something out? That was such a concrete expression, such a concrete demonstration for me of a small mindset shift in the right person can have a really material impact on what becomes then, how do we meet our CEO's demand in that way usefully? So, and that's not an HR thing or a safety thing. It's an organizational thing. And I think if you look at HR and safety as two really core capability units within organizations. I'd want both to be playing their part, not one or the other. I mean, how do you see, is that something you see? How does that debate, is that a debate you're seeing across I'd be particularly interested. Is that something you're seeing in your Australian clients, that who owns this from a functional perspective?
Yeah, definitely. It's a bit of a stoush between health and safety and HR. HR, they tend to like to hold on to the portfolio of workplace mental health. Health and safety we're seeing maybe reluctant in picking up the mantle, even though this is now falling under workplace health and safety legislation here in Australia with the regulatory reform that we've seen. And then there's some health and safety people who really want to play in this game because they believe in that systems level approach, right? And seeing how, from a physical health and safety perspective, it can have such a bigger impact across a population than just individual level interventions. And then, sometimes being waylaid by HR. It's probably rarer than common at the moment, at least, that they're playing nicely together.
Yeah, so I've certainly spoken to some companies who are sort of actively transitioning ownership of this scope of work from the people function through to the safety function. So they are being quite deliberate in how they're doing that. I think the other thing also is to distinguish between ownership of the risk management cycle, if you like, and then ownership of controls, and recognising that really a lot of your psych health and safety controls are actually going to sit within the HR function. So while health and safety might have ownership of the processes and the procedures around identifying hazards, assessing risks and exploring, what are the sort of the contributing or driving forces behind those, a lot of that, the solutions are actually going to go back to the systems of work that belong to HR. So there's that sort of distinguishing of who actually owns what piece of this Venn diagram and where do we overlap and how do we make sure that the sections of the Venn diagram are overlapping well. I think that's sort of where we need to land.
That's a really lovely articulation, I think, Joelle. And I think, and again, I think what it affirms for me is if you don't have cascading from the board to the chief executive or from the chief executive to the board down, if you don't have an understanding that actually you want to get high performance, you want to be across this efficiently and effectively, and you want us to unlock the good stuff that comes from this. Actually, you want to be really sniffing out, are my teams playing well together? Because my expectation is we're in sync and we're in line. And I just think, I think very often, and I've got real empathy for the size of the agendas around a lot of our chief executives tables at the moment. How do we make it as easy as possible for them to understand why that integration is important? What are the questions they can be asking of their teams, and what are some core frameworks or some structures to enable them to do that? And that's more around the why, I think, the why and some critical maybe what's to then let the team get on with the how. So I think that and so I mean, I don't know what you're seeing from a governance perspective, but again, I note that the Institute of Directors has been really good, close friends of the Business Leaders Forum here on keen to hear and understand, but I'm still seeing, it still feels like really governance communities getting their head around what are we responsible for. That still feels like maybe they're a couple of 3 years behind even where the chief executives are. Is that similar with what you're seeing in Australia?
Yeah, I think so. It's very much starting with how do we do this risk assessment piece seems to be the starting point. And then it's okay, we need a competence uplift as well to go along with that. And then, and we need systems of work to sustain it over time. And then, okay, and we need some governance to make sure that the systems of work are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. So, and maybe that's sort of being driven by the regulation in Australia, and that's kind of why people are starting with, we need to do a risk assessment, because that's what the regulations are basically telling them they need to do, is identify your hazards and implement controls and monitor controls. So that's kind of where they're starting. And then once they get started with that, they recognise that there are lots of other pieces to this puzzle that they also need to think about. So that generally tends to be the pattern that we're seeing. There are other organisations who I guess have been thinking about this and have been sort of developing strategy over probably the past 5 years, and so they're more mature in their thinking. They've been doing a lot more of that front end work more related to governance structures and long-term strategy. So for those organisations, it's a different picture. But I would say for most organisations, they're just going, oh no, we have to react to the regs and then think about what else they need to do.
Yeah, morally, I'd say the majority of executives and boards that we interact with, they all want the outcome, right? They want healthy, mentally well employees, but they haven't realised necessarily that link, like we're talking about, between the aquarium and mental health. And they're thinking, let's take a, Beyond Blue or like one of these charities that focus on mental ill health. We keep hearing like we need to make people aware of this and how to get assistance, not recognising, hey, actually, if we just improve the way we work around here, then that's actually going to drive a much bigger impact on people's mental health overall. But Francois, we are talking about something that's fairly mature, right? And organisations are still grappling, still trying to get their heads around this as well. Like Joelle was mentioning, it's getting thrust upon organisations and people are having to make quicker decisions because of regulation reform here in Australia, but not so in the rest of the world. So I guess for those that aren't grappling with this yet, who aren't at that level of maturity yet, what are the implications?
Well, I often say to people, one of the things I often see people reluctant to step into the space out of a level of maybe a concern around their own maturity is, it's like opening Pandora's box. There's a level of anxiety of opening Pandora's box or worrying that there's rattlesnakes under the stones. Well, the rattlesnakes are there regardless. Whether you look, Donald Trump famously said during halfway through the first branch of COVID, he stopped testing and then said and so the positive rates were very low because they weren't testing.
Yeah.
Guess what? People were still getting COVID just because you weren't capturing it. So I think the dilemma for those, the implications of those that are maybe reluctant to grapple with this is you're going to be dealing with all of the consequences of not managing it. You're going to be having people walk out the door and you won't know why. Or the things that they're walking out the door at a point where skills retention and recruitment's really, really important. You're getting these people walking out and you're ignorant of what you could be doing around that. So I would say you're going to be dealing with the consequences regardless. You're going to be having
that's important. Just to cut you off, say sorry, Francois.
No,
is that it's something that I posted about recently about this risk blind spot. What is your appetite for this risk blind spot? The less you ask, the less you inquire, the bigger the blind spot. But like you say, they're still going to be experiencing the same outcomes that we'd expect for mentally unhealthy work. So
yeah, and I think also I one way or the other, maybe it's inverse or from a recruitment perspective, I can imagine. Do you want to be the place of work that's? I've been speaking to a bunch of organisations, and maybe it's manifesting around some of the maybe the more fashionable elements, but questions like work-life balance and flex workplaces, they're just table stakes now, right? They're just table stakes. They're almost not even asked for because the working assumption is if you're not even in a space to bat for that, come on. And so, the worker expectations are shifting up. And so if you're not wanting to step into that space, you're going to find yourself, I think, increase. Now, where the future of work sits and how that, I'm agnostic on what that could look like. All I know is it's going to be different than what it was. I've got a beautiful 16, almost 17-year-old daughter. I can tell you, she just got an excellence grade on a year 12 paper on addiction. That's what they're studying at year 12. So tomorrow's workers are sitting in a different space. So not stepping into the space, the implication is whether or not you like the fact that that's where it's going. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. So you can either move with that thing and respond to that thing. And that doesn't mean following a fashion and psych safety is the new black or whatever, but there is change afoot. Now you either want to be thinking, how do we understand what that looks like? People will leave and you won't know why. And I think there's equally an element that certainly in New Zealand, and I think to an extent in Australia, there has been sort of a stalling of our safety performance improvements as well. And sometimes I think and some people are quite reluctant around, look, as someone actually said to me just recently, Francois, everyone has mental health. I get that, but you only have mental health if you're alive. So I'm going to focus first on making sure people stay alive. Interestingly, this workplace has never had a fatality. So it's it's kind of like, yeah, I don't think that's your acute need, but there's kind of almost this artificial trade-off between safety first, then mental health. And it's kind of your and thing. So I think one of the potential implications is, yes, truck hit person killed. So that was a safety incident because it was acute blunt force trauma that killed this person. And it was clearly something around that occurred in the cab of that truck or in the workplace space that resulted in the death. But is it possible, just possible, there might have been some other stuff going on in the cab of that truck and the head of the person in the cab of that truck or the head of the person walking across that gangway or wherever that contributed to that factor? So again, health on safety and safety on health, hugely important dynamic. And so again, one of the implications of not stepping into the space is actually you might be kneecapping your own safety performance improvements and a whole range of other performances that are just going. So I think the challenge is, how do we make them bite-sizable? How do we make them not just feel like more, but bring some alignment to it? But I mean, I think one way or the other, and COVID has been like this. COVID has fundamentally changed some things, but my broader hypothesis is that what it's done is it's just accelerated existing cracks. It's accelerated and made and amplified changes that were already present. And so I think, particularly around flex and hybrid work, again, the jury's out on how that's going to land. But the idea that everyone's always going to be at the office all of the time is patently not true. Are there benefits of getting people there? Yeah. Well, be clear on what they are. Make it a good place to be. Extract all the value of being with colleagues that you can. Do it purposefully. Don't just do it with beanbags and spiral slides and, drink machines in the corner. So, the world is changing, and I think sometimes for us as sort of tragics working in the space a lot of time, I think language counts. And I think, psychological health and safety, I mean, they're three really problematic words, right? Psychological, health and safety. How do we mainstream this, and how do we find other ways? And that's why I think colorful metaphors and powerful narrative and I think the ability to start small become really important tactics and practices, because otherwise what this becomes is just another complex nuggety issue on an already massively full of, where does inclusion and diversity? Well, guess what? That's part of the same thing. It's not a separate thing. It's the same. ESG, this is your social sustainability commitment. So how do we align these things so they're not additives, they're integrated value adds, and I think that sometimes it's actually just going to be hard work. But I think there's a lot we can do around articulating and making it easier for those people that are reluctant to say, and actually, look, in the words of Todd Conklin, who's a famous American thought leader in the safety space, Todd often says, is the lemon worth the squeeze? And I think around mentally healthy work and mental health at work, the lemon is definitely worth the squeeze.
So that leads nicely into my next question. I guess recognizing that executives and business leaders are very time poor a lot of the time and have so much in their remit that sort of needs to take up space in their brain. Mm-hmm. What approaches are currently working in helping to educate them about mentally healthy work?
I think, it's probably a bit of a distillation of what we're saying. Don't assume they know what you mean. I call it my Charlie Brown engagement, that shows my age. I'm not 10 this week, Joelle. I'm 50 next week.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. And I always remember as a kid, the thought, the straight line coming out of the mouth is words and the bubble is a thought. And I'm always interested. I say mentally healthy work or mental health, or you're coming along to talk about mental health. What's in your thought bubble right now with your neighbor? What are you thinking? And when you get that on the table, then you know what you're dealing with, because everyone's going to be right, but everyone is right. Not that person, that person. So if we're not clear in agreement that everything we've talked about here is on the agenda, and then we can go to the continuum, and then we can go to the natures of that continuum, that's a really important step. How do we and it does two things. One, it gets us clear on concepts and language so we can be on the same page about understanding the issue. And I'm just going to be like a stuck record. I think that's the most critical first step. Think about how you can get your busy people clear on what's the issue we're asking you to focus your mind on. The other one is by them being able to put their thoughts in there. Hilary Bennett often talks about what's the rock in your shoe around these issues. What it also lets them do is you're not an evangelical missionary. I'm not trying to convince you to the church of psychological health and safety. What are your concerns? What's your rock in the shoe? Well, I'm worried I'm responsible for everything. My rock in my shoe. Where does individual responsibility sit in this conversation? Why is it all me? And you go, actually, guess what? There is some individual responsibility and there's some work. There's mutual responsibility here. So what you can do is the worst thing you can do with, I think, busy people is tell them that they have to do it your way. How do you elicit for them? Where is their mind currently and what's their bugbear? And then guess what? The evidence we know we have access to is actually there's a way through here, but orient to where they're at, not to what page in the Bible you're at around how you want to bring them to the shining path. And I think I just see again and again and again, that's the mistake people have engaging their senior teams. They either start with a product or they start with their view of the truth. Start with where your people are at and let them use their words and trust yourself to then be able to make sense of the issue from their perspective. And that's because then people feel like you're actually engaging them on making sense of their world, not ramming something down their already full throat on a whole lot of other issues. So I would say start with where people are at, really get clear on the issues and don't assume everyone's on the same page. And have stories and examples that can link it back to problems beyond just mental health and well-being. And I know linking it to productivity can sound a little bit glib, but the more you can connect it to those things that actually have other value, link it to ESG commitments. Tell a story around that. Find a story about that. Make a story up about that. Productivity, efficiency, judgment, safety connections. This is a rising tide issue that if you get right, lifts multiple boats. And so I think, again, the ability to link both the risk and the benefit is a really important element as well. And the last thing I think around how to bring people on is by doing that, what you're doing is you're thinking big. And whether it's our sense-making framework or the three component framework you were talking about before, Jason, think big and then go, where do we start that's small? And view it as a longer term commitment, but say we're not going the full hog, we're starting here. And but this is the big picture. And actually, if we're not aware of the big picture, we're wasting your time, but we want to move towards that. So thinking big, but starting small, understand the issues and starting with where people are at would be the three things that for me, I see time and time again, passionate people with good intention steamrolling over. And what you've got is a busy person going, are you selling to me? Are you asking me to sign off on the thing before I've even agreed the problem? And then what happens is the conversation's just in reverse from then on. Or worst case scenario, they don't really care and they want you to go away and they spend the $80,000 on an app that 2% of the workforce use that were already fine. Or the working well, get the free fruit on a Thursday and don't have to do anything else. And the dollar's spent. And next year when you find something actually meaningful, the money's gone. They spent that 80 grand, didn't have a benefit. Actually, the whole thing gets tarred with that brush that this is all a bit of a fluff. And you lose the permission to do it again. So that idea of big, start small, start with where people are at and link it to other benefits, I think that they would be the tips I've seen. Well, I've had experience with myself and have seen others, do well. I mean, do they chime with you guys? Do they
Definitely.
Very sage advice.
Yeah, that very much resonates with what we find works as well. We need to understand, from our perspective, it's the client. We need to understand where they're at and help them to develop an approach that's going to work for their business, for their culture, for their people, for the issues that are their pain points right now. Interestingly, I worked at an organisation that did have the free fruit bowls, and they were actually a cause of a lot of office drama.
It's another hazard, right?
I wanted that last banana. Who took that? Actually created conflict.
But it's interesting, right? Because like you say, you need to understand the problem first before you bring a solution to the table. And that's one of the brightest points that regulation is driving in Australia, because you have to do a risk assessment, right? You have to identify your hazards. So you need to understand what the problem is, and then your controls should actually address the hazard. Joelle and I both come from an organizational psychology background, and diagnosis is, step one, pretty much. Like, understand the problem. And companies have largely gone, I don't want to invest time or money into diagnosing the problem. I kind of have a sense, or this thing that I'm looking at is really well, marketed, and the person behind it's really passionate. I'm just going to spend money on that. But then the money is often wasted because I haven't done the diagnosis and understood the solution properly. So it is quite nice that the regulations are saying, actually, you do actually have to do a diagnosis now, and spend the time and money thinking about that. And then your controls should really address the root problems.
Well, and I think, again, I'm conscious that COVID is a little bit triggering for some people, so I'm mindful of bringing it on the table. But equally, the historian in me, I'm not an historian, the history fan in me says, actually, that was a globally unique experience. That was the first time in over 100 years, and certainly the first time in the living history of everyone on the earth at the moment, of a global single point focus of a shared challenge. And if everyone talks about we can't wait to get back to normal, I'm not quite sure. I didn't read the memo of anyone saying in 2019, we've done it, we're here, we've reached the pinnacle. We just need to make sure we stay here. So the idea of getting back to 2019, I don't think the world was that great then either. But secondly, in 2019, well, the idea of changing the work, not the person, too hard, right? Well, guess what? I can work from home. I can mobilize my entire 2,000 person workforce to work at home with laptops in a week if I have to, and do it. I'm thinking of my friends and family in Auckland and friends in Melbourne that had protracted long periods at home. Guess what? They managed to make work happen. So I don't want to get into issues of vaccine mandates and state control and all of that freedom stuff. But we've proven when we need to, actually, we can change and move mountains. And so the invitation, I think, is how do we bank that lesson with our organizations to say, do we need to wait for existential threats for us to make those changes, or can we proactively step into that space and hunt out those rattlesnakes, with purpose? And so I think we've shown we can, and so I think that's a real, from an agency perspective, we've really, we've demonstrated to ourselves, I think, quite powerfully what we can do more than we thought.
Yeah, so I was going to bring that up before when you said COVID really demonstrated where the gaps were, and really showed those cracks and made them look like as big as what they were. But I agree with you. It also showed that when we need to make systemic changes to the way we work, we can do it very quickly if it becomes a business imperative. Yeah. So how do we prioritize these things, right? Like fixing the environment and the design of work.
Yeah.
Hey, Francois, I am conscious of time because we did say to you that an hour and a half was kind of the longest. I think we're tracking to have one of the longest ones, but it's been a really flippin' good conversation, Francois.
If anyone watches this that knows me, and there might be one, they'll go, they could have pre-warned you full in advance that I'm not a man of few words. I think I did.
When we were talking, I did suspect that this would be a long one. I think I mentioned that to you.
Yeah, you got a lot to say, and it all makes a lot of sense. It really echoes our observations.
Jason, what I'll say is I've got a lot of other people's wine that I can pour into a collective bottle. A lot of these ideas and experiences are from others, is what I'll say.
Yeah, and and that's powerful, right? Like, I'm finding there's some LinkedIn posts that I'm doing that seem to really resonate because I am able to, like you listen to a lot of people, you distill their problems and you go, well, this is what it sounds like. Yeah. I really enjoy that part of my job too. But I guess more broadly speaking, I know you've been working in this area and it hasn't been your prime focus. Mental health, obviously broader, physical health and safety as well, or health and safety in general is part of what you do. But bringing the conversation back to what we've been talking about today, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health from here?
I think my hope is around us being able to get to a point where we can frame healthy and safe and mentally well workplace in a more singular, combined, integrated way. And so for us in the forum space, we redid our 10-year strategy about 2 years ago, and it was the work we were doing that I'd done with Hillary, and this idea of thriving people really resonated with me because I've worked in a regulatory space and we talk about beyond compliance. Beyond compliance suggests compliance is a bad thing. Compliance is a really important thing. You're growing up accountabilities, take them seriously. So I didn't want to come up with 1,000 different ways of describing our objective by not using the word compliance. But equally, I know health and safety doesn't make you the most popular person at the barbie. So how do we also change that? And what I loved about thriving people is you can't thrive if you've been injured. You can't thrive if you're at threat of being injured. You can't thrive if there's no purpose at work. You can't thrive if you're worried of being invited to a sexual harassment VR exercise on a sofa. Or maybe you can if you've got the spirit of the organisation at hand. And so this idea of thriving as where we want to be, who doesn't want their team to thrive? And the idea of safety and health and well-being being connected to productivity, actually it depends how you do it. Safety's not good for business. It depends how you do it is whether it's good for business. So my goal or objective, or what I would love for the world, is leaders really understanding what's the work they do to build cultures that enable people and businesses to thrive. That's what I would like. The leaders' work is around the aquarium management, the soil preparation, whatever the metaphor. That's where they put their focus. And if they can support their people to thrive, the business will thrive. So it's almost like, how do we create a thriving hierarchy, not a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that lets us talk about a thriving person, not in an esoteric sense. If you've got issues with cutting off your people's fingers, stop cutting off your people's fingers, but don't cut off your people's fingers because compliance is your objective. What we can paint for them is a picture of saying, you can do that in service of something a lot bigger than just compliance. And I think what the mentally healthy work element brings into the conversation is the whole person. And it brings into the conversation people that don't wear steel cap boots. And it brings into the conversation people that aren't exposed to trucks and gas and electricity. It lets us broaden that conversation and bring in purpose and meaning and really important cultural things. So that's my hope. And it's not going to be quick. I won't be out of work soon. But if we can start to reposition and reframe the leadership work in this space around thriving people and thriving businesses, that when I'm at my 70th birthday, I'd like to think we're a little bit closer to that being true.
Yeah, I'm an optimist, as Joelle will tell you, and I'm hoping by that in 20 years' time, yes, we are there.
Francois, do you have words of advice for listeners who want to work in the field of psych health and safety?
Growth area. I'd say it's important. I'd say step into it with excitement and purpose. And like I said, my journey was one of being reluctant to step into that space to now having a genuine belief that it's a really critical part of the combination to the culture safe. So frame it and view it in those terms. And listen as much as you talk. Listen.
It's an important one.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Francois, it's been an amazing conversation. One of our longest, but I reckon it will go down as probably our top 10 well.
Yeah. You'll get to the top 10 pretty quick.
We've done 150 episodes, Francois, so it's saying something. Nice. It was really great, really articulate, and really, you can tell you've had a lot of those conversations. You've listened well, but you've been able now to distill that, and so thank you for distilling that for our listeners today.
No, thanks for the opportunity. I love your work, and to your listeners, crack on. This is important stuff.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Francois. So listeners, that brings us to the end of this extraordinary episode. Remember, you can watch these episodes over YouTube. You're probably not going to watch this marathon again on YouTube, but with our other episodes, if you don't want to listen, you can watch. We also take some clips with our guests and we put them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page if you want some short snippets of some of the best pieces from this and other podcasts. While you're over on LinkedIn, feel free to connect with Joelle and myself and Francois if you want to continue the conversation. But that brings us to the end today. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.